Call me a poser, but the first time I ever played Super Mario Bros. Was in an emulator. I distinctly remember its bright, vibrant, saturated colors. There was a playfulness to it. Just looking at it, it felt warm and inviting. I grew up in the late 90s and early 2000s when we were just learning how to share things over the nascent internet. And as I started researching some of my new favorite 8-bit Nintendo games, I noticed something strange. Their Super Mario Bros. Didn't look like mine. The browns were browner, the blues were grayer, everything just looked a little off. I didn't really know what to make of it. I mean, the early internet was full of low quality images and videos. Was this just another instance of that? As I got more into retro gaming and learned more about the disparities between original hardware and emulators, I started to notice a trend. Footage from original hardware looked more like those pictures I saw and less like the emulators I grew up with. I started to assume those vibrant colors from my youth were just another emulator inaccuracy to turn my nose up at. The version on the Wii Virtual Console, often considered highly accurate, seemed to back that up. At the very least, it wasn't the colors I grew up with. But then things got even more confusing. Super Mario Maker famously had a mode that replicated the first Super Mario Bros. However, the colors here looked different again. Did Nintendo make a mistake? Were they just taking artistic license, cleaning up the muted colors for our modern sensibilities? But then looking at the game on the NES Classic, all of these are ostensibly supposed to be the same game, so why do they look so different? Which one is correct? Well, you may be surprised to hear the answer is none of them. It turns out there is no definitive consensus for exactly how the NES should look. But how is that possible? Why can't the NES make up its mind and say, this is the color I'm trying to make? Well, with newer game systems, the image is usually generated digitally in RGB by some kind of GPU, which is then sent to an encoder chip that converts the image into the various TV standards like composite and S-video. But this isn't how the NES works. Its graphics chip, known as the Picture Processing Unit, actually generates NTSC composite video directly. Rather than using RGB values, developers had 6 bits to define illuminance and chrominance, effectively mapping onto NTSC 1:1. The problem is, NTSC had many design goals: low cost, efficient on bandwidth, backwards compatible with black and white TVs. Perfect color reproduction? Not really one of them. While NTSC worked well in the lab, in practice it was notoriously prone to errors in color transmission. Anything from a TV's circuitry to long transmission distances to the signal bouncing off buildings and mount sites could cause the hue to shift, infamously making human skin tones take on more of a purple hue. These tendencies earned NTSC derisive nicknames like never twice the same color or no true skin color. But while these may sound like oversights, the NTSC designers knew from the beginning that it was sensitive to transmission errors. They intentionally allowed fairly wide tolerances in color accuracy to help keep costs and bandwidth low. If one TV's color didn't quite line up with another, which they often didn't just because they used different circuitry, it wasn't considered a big deal as long as it was still in the acceptable range. And finally, if the hue ever seemed really off, most NTSC TVs were equipped with a tint control allowing you to correct it by eye. All this is to say that in practice, NTSC color varied a lot. Even with an identical signal, it was rare for any two TVs to produce exactly the same image due to both differences in their internal circuitry and how they were adjusted by the viewer. It's easy to criticize NTSC for its shortcomings, and to be clear, there are a lot of them, but considering this was 1950 and they had to squeeze a full color image into the existing black and white broadcast, it was undoubtedly an engineering miracle for the time. How were they supposed to know that one day a video game console would base its entire color system on it? The NES, being directly connected to the TV, does not suffer from the same volatile color shifts as broadcast television. But again, even with exactly the same signal, two TVs rarely looked the same due to how NTSC was implemented, and the NES feed was no exception. As I said, the NES defines all of its colors as NTSC values, and while there are established algorithms for converting NTSC to RGB, that doesn't mean it'll look like your home TV from the 80s, or for that matter, the TV that the developers were designing on. All of us were beholden to whatever colors our TV gave us, and that's really the crux of the issue. Being scientifically correct with the NES is not the same thing as being true to the artist's vision, or the reason a lot of people play these games: nostalgia. If you really wanted to see exactly the same colors that the original artists were seeing, you'd have to know exactly what TV they were using, know where their tint control was set, track one down, assume the color circuitry didn't differ between each unit manufactured, and that it hadn't drifted at all in the last 40 years. It's not exactly practical is what I'm saying. You might be wondering, how does this all work with PAL, the European television format? PAL, being about 10 years newer, tried to improve on the notorious color issues of NTSC, and for the most part it did produce a much more consistent picture that eliminated the need for a tint control. That means, in theory, yes, PAL NESs were much more consistent between each TV. The problem is the NES was very much designed around NTSC. PAL was only bolted on later to bring it to Europe, at which point Nintendo realized they couldn't quite achieve the same palette there. So games developed with NTSC monitors, which happened to be the vast majority of them, all ended up looking a little off. Just because it's consistent doesn't mean it's consistently right. Coupled with running 16% slower due to PAL being 50Hz instead of 60, PAL players almost universally got the worst versions of NES games. So basically, NES color is a mess. Developers could choose what they thought looked best, but only had so much control over how it would be received. I almost wonder how frustrating this was for them. You could choose a brilliantly vibrant blue only for players to see a dull purple instead. It's like trying to plot points on a color wheel, except no one can quite agree where the wheel even is. But this issue really came into focus when it came time to develop emulators. If everyone grew up with a slightly different color palette, how do you agree on which one to use? Well, the answer is, you don't. Today there are dozens, if not hundreds of NES palettes out there to choose from, and virtually all major emulators allow you to override whatever they default to. Some of them used guesswork, some of them used algorithms, some of them sampled color off their own childhood TV. None of these are objectively right or wrong, they're just different opinions on how NES games should look. It's all we have given the variability of NTSC. Some people have spent years trying to perfect the ultimate palette, and even then people can't agree whether it's the best one or not. Ultimately, there is no consensus, it's just whatever looks right to you. Yeah, it all comes back to adjusting the tint control, and while it is a shame that there's no real way to achieve exactly what the original developers were going for, the fact is they almost certainly designed for that reality. Artists would have looked at the game on multiple different monitors, and if anything looked egregiously wrong, they would have corrected it. In that sense, you could argue no TV got it wrong. And in a way, this is all part of the charm of the NES. The hardware was so primitive, so much of it was hacks built on top of hacks, but those brilliant developers were able to make unforgettable experiences with it even so. It's the reason we're still talking about the NES over 40 years later. So really, as long as it looks good to you, that's all that matters. The developers are probably just happy we're still playing it all. But here's a question. If the NES produces nothing but composite video, how do people mod it to get a crystal clear RGB, or for that matter HDMI feed out of it? Well, it's actually pretty interesting, and if you want to hear all about it, click the link on the screen to see part 2. Of course, special thanks to my patrons and members scrolling on the screen right now for making these videos possible. If you'd like to get early access to videos just like this one, as well as at least one bonus video every month, sign up using the links in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye guys.